the Watcher on Route 17. It was called the loneliest stretch of highway in the state, Route 17. The road cut through a dense pine forest with no gas stations, rest stops, or cell service. Truck drivers spread rumors. If you drive down that road at night, you might see him. Kaylee didn't believe in ghost stories, but she hated late-night drives. However, after a long shift at the diner, she had no choice but to take Route 17 to get home. It was well past midnight when she turned onto the road. Her headlights barely sliced through the darkness, and the trees seemed to close in around her. Then she saw it, a figure in her rearview mirror. A man in a dark coat stood by the roadside, staring directly at her car. She gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept driving. A few minutes later, she saw him again, now ahead of her. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on her. This can't be real, she thought. How did he get ahead of me so fast? Her heart raced as she drove past him, refusing to look directly at him. But in her rearview mirror, he was still there, walking behind her now, with his head tilted strangely, as though his neck could hardly support it. The third time she saw him, tears were already streaming down her face. He stood in the middle of the road, forcing her to slam on the brakes. She blinked, and he was gone. It was then that she heard a knock on her window. Kaylee froze, felt as though her heart stopped for a moment. The knock came again, louder, more insistent this time. She glanced at the window and almost screamed. The man stood there. His face was blurred, as if it had been smeared like an old photograph. His eyes, if they were eyes, stared straight at her. Kaylee wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in her throat. She kept her foot on the gas pedal, ready to accelerate, but she couldn't make herself move. The man tilted his head, and she heard a low, raspy whisper coming through the glass. "Let me in. I need to come in." Suddenly, headlights from another car appeared around the bend, illuminating her car and the figure of the man. But as soon as the light touched him, he vanished, disappearing into the air as though he had never been there. Kaylee grabbed her phone, though she knew there was no signal. Her hands trembled as she started the car and pressed the accelerator. Her car sped down the road, and with every turn, she felt like she would see that man again. Finally, after a few more miles, she saw a sign. A small roadside diner, its lights glowing like a life-saving beacon. She stopped in the parking lot and rushed inside. The bartender looked at her. "Are you okay?" Kaylee was gasping for breath. "There was a man on the road. He was following me." The bartender turned pale. "You saw him? You know about him?" He nodded, leaning closer. "It's an old myth, but everyone around here knows. If you see the Watcher, it's not over. He always comes back. Now he's yours." Kaylee rushed back to her car. She drove like she was on autopilot, trying to make sense of the craziness she had just heard. But when she neared her house, her heart dropped again. The light in her living room window was on. She was certain she had turned it off before leaving. That night, she locked all the doors, closed the windows, and left the lights on in every room. Sleep was impossible. Kaylee sat on the couch, her phone in her hands, counting the hours until dawn. Around 3 in the morning, she heard what she feared most. Knock, knock. The sound came again, but not from the front door. It was coming from the window in the living room. Her blood froze. Slowly, she turned her head, and there he was, the Watcher. His blurry face pressed against the glass, his head still tilted at that strange angle. "Let me in. I need to come in." His voice barely resembled a human's, deep and cold. Kaylee couldn't move. Hours passed, and though she never opened the door, the man did not disappear. His whisper grew louder, as though he was already inside. By dawn, Exhausted, Kaylee realized the fight would never end. He would never leave. A week later, the police found her car on the side of Route 17. There was no trace of Kaylee. Her house was empty, and every window was shattered from the inside. Although she was officially listed as missing, locals whispered that the watcher had claimed another victim.